Hello, I'm David Rubenstein. I'm here at the Members Room of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. as part of the National Book Festival. And we're very pleased today to have in another Washington State, Bob Gates, who has written a book called Exercise of Power, which I've read and highly recommend. Now, we're going to talk about this book and also a little bit about Bob's career. And I should point out that Bob and I worked together a long time ago, about 4 decades ago, in the Carter White House when I was Deputy Domestic Policy Assistant to Stuart Eizenstat, and Bob Gates was Executive Assistant to Zbigniew Brzezinski. So in those days, Bob, did you ever think that you would one day become one of the most famous Secretaries of Defense and have this heralded career? Did you ever think about that when you were his Executive Assistant?
Well, first of all, David, we're probably both at situations today that we never dreamt about back in the late 1970s. But no, I joined CIA in 1966. I was recruited out of the Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University, and just to do my bit in the Cold War. And I never dreamed in those days that I would end up being the director of CIA at the very time the Soviet Union collapsed. So it was quite a trajectory, and nothing I could have ever predicted.
So for those who haven't followed Bob's career, Bob was not only the head of the CIA, but for 5 years, the Secretary of Defense under 2 presidents, President Bush 43 and President Obama. He was also the Chancellor of Texas A&M University for a number of years as well. So Bob, for people who are watching, younger people, and they say, okay, I want to have a career like Bob Gates, what would you say is advice you can give them? Practice what skills, perfect what? What would you say is the key to having the kind of career you did in government and after government?
I think it starts with having a passion for what you choose to do and really caring about it and being committed to it. The sad news is you have to do all the hard work of preparation to be in a position to be successful, but there are no guarantees. And I think the key is to establish yourself as an expert or as very capable in one area, and then having done that, begin to expand your horizons. As you expand your horizons, though, there are risks involved. And what most people don't realize is that just as you have to take risks to be successful in the private sector, I think you have to take some risks and get out of your comfort zone to be successful in public service as well. So when I first went to the National Security Council in the last months of the Nixon administration, my bosses at CIA basically told me there probably wouldn't be a job for me when I came back. I took the risk and it worked out okay. I think the other thing is to do different things, get different experiences, even within the same career field. When I became Secretary of Defense and I was looking at people to promote to a service secretary or chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or a combatant commander like Central Command and so on, I looked for people who had done a number of different things, had gone outside of their career specialty and had been involved in doing things with other services, had been involved in the policy process at the White House or State Department. I wanted people with a variety of experiences. So I think that's part of a successful career in public service as well.
So Bob, in this career you've had as Secretary of Defense, head of the CIA, and many other things you've done in government, what would you say is the most memorable thing that happened to you? And what would you say is the highlight, the thing you're most proud of having achieved in your public service career?
I think that those actually are 2 different things for me. The most fun and the most gratifying, or the most satisfying, if you will, was, as I said, having joined CIA in the very at the very height of the Cold War, to be Deputy National Security Advisor under the first President Bush and involved in the day-to-day diplomacy and activities involved in the liberation of Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany, the victory in the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of those things, when you went into work every day, you knew history was being made, and be able to spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day with the first President Bush as managing all of those things at that momentous moment in history was really quite extraordinary. I think the most gratifying thing that I did in my public service was when I was Secretary of Defense, and I was able to do things that helped the troops. Getting approval and getting mine-resistant, ambush-protected trucks into the field that saved a lot of lives and a lot of limbs. They replaced the Humvees, and we bought 27,000 of them at a cost of $40 billion, and who knows how many thousand lives were saved. Reducing the medevac times in Afghanistan, managing and overseeing the elimination of don't ask, don't tell. The things that I found the most gratifying were actually those that I felt helped the people, the men and women who were in uniform, and those on the front lines, and being in a position to do something about it and make a difference really was extraordinarily gratifying.
I've always assumed that one of the most difficult things about being Secretary of Defense is you have to notify the next of kin when someone dies who's a serviceman or woman under your watch. What is that like?
Well, the way the process works, David, is that there is someone from there is an officer and an enlisted person from that person's service who will actually do the direct notification of the family, and so I never had to do that. Every night I would write condolence letters to the families, and I would handwrite notes on all of those, and that was very onerous and was very emotional for me, because I insisted I didn't want any of them to become statistics for me. And so I would insist that when I was told I needed to write a condolence letter, I wanted a picture of the person who had been killed. I wanted the hometown newspaper so that I could know what their coaches and their parents and their brothers or sisters had to say about them, and whether they were kind of a lost soul and found purpose in the military, or whether they joined out of patriotism, and so on. So writing those notes was very emotional for me. I think the hardest thing for me was visiting the hospitals and seeing these very fit and robust, mainly young men, who had had legs blown off. I saw the first quadruple amputee, lost both of his arms and his legs, and was in the room with his family, his parents. Those visits were very, very hard, and I would do them at not only at the military hospital in Landstuhl, where in Germany, where they would be flown from Afghanistan or Iraq, but also at Walter Reed and the various hospitals around the United States. I think the hardest of all was probably the burn unit at Brooke Army Hospital, but those visits weighed very heavily on me. And then I would say also, I attended quite a number of their funerals at Arlington. I felt it was important to be there, and that was the one time I did come face to face with the families of those who had been killed in action, and that was very, very difficult.
No doubt. So the main theme of the book, if I'll summarize it, and you can say I've summarized it correctly or not, is essentially, as I read it, that after the Cold War, the United States was the dominant military and geopolitical power in the world, and we could have done so many things to improve the world with our power, but we chose to use our military power rather than what some have called our soft power. And as a result of that, we've been in a lot of wars that maybe we didn't need to be in. And ultimately, what we really should have is a president who knows how to use soft power as opposed to hard power. Is that a fair or inaccurate summary?
No, I think that pretty well captures it. I think, in 1993, at the end of the Cold War, the United States held a degree of monopoly on military, economic, political, cultural power, probably unprecedented since the Roman Empire around the world. And there were two problems. The first is that President Clinton and President Bush 43, the second President Bush, both had something of a Wilsonian, a Woodrow Wilson stripe in them, in that they thought the United States should use its power to bring democracy and improve the lives to people around the world. And President Clinton tried it in Somalia and to a certain degree in Haiti, and those were both failures, lessons that should have been learned by the Bush administration. And after the initial military successes in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Bush administration tried to do the same thing in terms of bringing a better life, bringing democracy and modern government to both countries. And that was the problem. And the argument that I make in the book is that we had, at the end of the Cold War, dismantled most of the non-military instruments of power the country held, whether it was diplomacy or the Agency for International Development. In the 1990s, the United States Information Agency was totally dismantled. And so all of these non-military capabilities shrank almost to insignificance. At the same time, we continued to have and build a strong military. And one of the consequences of that was that the military over the years was asked to undertake missions that really weren't military missions. The military is not trained nor equipped to do nation building. But the civilian experts were so few in number that the task fell to the military anyway. So it led to what I believe was an over-militarization of U.S. foreign policy. And I think that exhausted the patience of the American people.
So it is interesting that the person who makes this argument that military power has been overused is a former Secretary of Defense. One might say somebody like a former Secretary of State or somebody who wasn't in charge of the military would have made that argument. Do you find that slightly ironic that you're the person who's making this argument?
I first made this argument in a speech at Kansas State University in the fall of 2007, and the press sort of treated it as a man bites dog story. What's the Secretary of Defense doing, calling for more resources for the Department of State? But I think one of the things that came home to me during that first year I was in office, David, was what the military was being asked to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how poorly equipped we were to do it, and how weak the civilian instruments were. And I'll just give you one example. So what the primary civilian development organization or units that were created in Iraq were called provincial reconstruction teams. And at the height of the surge, we had 170,000 troops in Iraq. And at the same time, there were just 360 civilians in those provincial reconstruction teams. So that was the disparity that I saw as Secretary of Defense, and that we were being asked to do something that was not in our wheelhouse.
It's not the main theme of your book, but I think everybody watching would want to know this. Secretary Rumsfeld was the secretary who was the Secretary of Defense when we went into Iraq, and he obviously proposed that and supported it. After that didn't, I'd say, work as well as he thought it was going to, and obviously as others thought it was going to, you were ultimately brought in I think it was 2006, as the Secretary of Defense. What was the main thing that you tried to do as Secretary of Defense to mitigate the problems we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how did you think those steps that you took worked?
Well, I became Secretary of Defense at a time when we were in the middle of two wars and in all honesty, losing both. And so my primary task was the very immediate one of how do we turn around this trajectory? President Bush made the very courageous decision, rather than to pull out of Iraq and let chaos reign, to reinforce the U.S. military position there, in the belief that if you could bring greater day-to-day security for the Iraqis, that then they would turn to some kind of economic development and perhaps pursue some kind of political reconciliation. And in terms of restoring security, the surge did that. And the surge really began in early 2007. And actually by fall of 2007, we'd seen a significant reduction in not only our own casualties, but a significant improvement in the security situation in Baghdad, which would continue. So really by 2008, we had created the circumstances in which Iraq had a chance at least to move forward. So
why do you think it is that we kind of we kind of struck down all the non-military powers that we had, the ones you alluded to, communications powers and cultural powers, other things the president could use, and emphasize military after the end of the Cold War. Why do you think that was? It was just easier to do military, or the other things were harder to do?
Well, I think that's part of it, but I think a big part of it was political. And the reality is that the State Department and Agency for International Development and U.S. Information Agency had no constituency in Congress. I mean, one of the things about the Defense Department is it spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And as I found out when I was secretary, the Department of Defense has contractors in every state, in every congressional district. That's probably not by accident on the part of the Congress. And so you have a built-in constituency, both Republican and Democrat, for support of defense programs where you don't have that kind of support for the civilian side. Foreign assistance, which comes under the Agency for International Development, has long been one of the most unpopular government programs there is. So what it takes is leadership on the part of the president and others, and on the Hill, to help educate the American people why those capabilities are important, how relatively little they cost. One of the points that I make in the book is that in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, the United States ranks 21st in the world in terms of how much we offer in foreign assistance. So, and furthermore, we keep quiet about the successes we do have. We don't tell anybody about it. And that's another problem that we have, the absence of a strategic communications capability. So I think it's mainly the lack of a constituency, and also a feeling on the part of some, including presidents, that for example, the Agency for International Development doesn't do a very good job in selecting projects and in seeing through to completion, accountability, and so on.
So you talk about in the book, The Exercise of Power, that a president is like a symphony conductor. He can, or she can, conduct the orchestra by having all the pieces that you've talked about come together. But unfortunately, many of the presidents haven't really done that. Are there one or two presidents you think have been reasonably good in conducting that symphony? And who would they be if there are any you would want to mention?
Well, I think during the Cold War, President Eisenhower, President Reagan, and probably the first President Bush were really good at conducting the symphony, if you will. I would say there are specific instances after the end of the Cold War where presidents have done a pretty good job of using soft power of conducting that symphony. President Clinton's diplomacy in Bosnia during the early 90s, his program to forgive debt of African countries and to create trade opportunities for African countries with the United States. The Colombia initiative, the Plan Colombia, that basically prevented narco-terrorists from taking over the control of the government of Colombia, which was supported by multiple presidents, beginning with President Clinton, but was sustained under both President Bush and President Obama, and was successful, and was orchestrated by the State Department with the U.S. military playing a support role. I think President Bush's initiative to deal with HIV/AIDS in Africa was another example of bringing together tools of soft power, if you will, or the non-military instruments of power to accomplish objectives that were important in their own right, but also served American interests.
Well, let me just ask you about two questions in your career before I ask about some other things in the book that I've always been interested in. You're minding your own business. You're the chancellor of the Texas A&M, a very good school in Texas. And it's a place where President Bush 41 had his presidential library. And I think you were the head of the public service school there, or the George Bush School, before you became the chancellor. And then you got a call one day saying, how about becoming Secretary of Defense by President George W. Bush? Were you surprised to get that call? And did you really want to go back in the government and deal with that mess that you had to inherit?
So in January of 2005, the White House reached out right after President Bush had been reelected to see if I would become the first director of national intelligence. And I really wrestled with that decision and ultimately turned it down. So I told my wife that the good news was that the Bush administration would never, ever ask me to do anything again, because I think they thought I would take that job. So I was stunned when I got the call. And unlike the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence offer, I remember vividly the National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley, called me on a weekend when I was president of Texas A&M. And he said, if the president asked you to become the Secretary of Defense, would you do it? And really, there wasn't any hesitation at all. I said, Steve, you know, with all these young men and women out there doing their duty and fighting and dying, how can I not do mine? Of course, I'll do it. So there was no hesitation. And of course, when I hung up the phone, I immediately panicked, wondering what I would tell my wife about going back to Washington, D.C. But no, I had no hesitation, but it came as a real shock. I had no prior inkling that anything like that might happen.
Well, another question is was it shocking that a Democratic president, President Obama, would say to you, I want you to stay on as Secretary of Defense, because historically, Secretaries of State or Secretary of Defense leave after a president leaves office. Were you surprised at that? And did you hesitate about taking that job under a president who you didn't really know?
I was very surprised, but I didn't hesitate, again, for the same reason. And I told him, I said, you know, we've still got all those kids out there putting their lives on the line. If you think I can help, I'll do whatever I can. And I'd heard rumors in the summer of 2008, both from the McCain campaign and from the Obama camp, that they might ask me to stay on for a little while, just so there'd be continuity, given the fact that we were still in the middle of two wars. But it would be for a very short period of time, or I assumed it would be. And then in October, just before the election, a representative of Obama reached out and asked if I'd meet with the president-elect, meet with the senator. And I said, no, I don't think I can do that properly before the election, but I will write down some questions that I have for him should he be elected, and he wants to pursue this. And I got a call a few days later after having those questions delivered, and he said, well, and this was after the election, he said, the president-elect wants to know whether you want the answers in writing. I said, no, it's not a test. It's just a guide for a conversation. But when he and I sat down in our secret meeting in the firehouse at Reagan National Airport, he pulled that list out of his pocket and went right down through the questions.
Wow. So let's go through this situation. Let's suppose the President of the United States, President Trump or President Biden, says to you, Bob, you have a distinguished service in your career. You've got a lot of insights. I could use your insights. Let's go through the major international challenges that the next president's going to face, whoever that person is. So why don't we start with China? What would you tell the next president of the United States? And China is something you've written extensively about in this book, about some of the mistakes we've made, some of the things we may have done right. But what would you tell the next president to do with respect to the challenges we now have with China?
Well, I think first it would be the acknowledgement that we're in for a very long competition with China in every facet of power, military, economic, political. There will be a contest for markets, for influence, and this will be a rivalry that will go on indefinitely. We need to be prepared for that, and we need to have the tools to wage it, and that means a lot of non-military tools as well as a strong military. At the same time, Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, has been able to do what no one else has been able to do, and that's bring the Republicans and the Democrats together in the Congress with an anti-Chinese perspective. So I think the one thing that the next president has to sort of focus on is, okay, we're in this rivalry for a long time, but we need for it to be peaceful coexistence. We need to go back to an old term of the Cold War with the Soviets, and we need to have peaceful coexistence. We will compete with each other, but we have to do everything we can to keep this from becoming a military competition or a military confrontation. So we have to figure out, how do we strengthen those instruments of power for our rivalry with China and for competing and besting China in a variety of different areas, but also how do we keep this thing from getting out of control?
Okay, so let's suppose the next president says, thank you for your ideas from China. What do I do with Russia? How do I get the Russians out of Ukraine? And how do I deal with bringing Russia back into the Western nations that are committed to peace and democracy?
Well, here I'm afraid I would be a pessimist with the president and have to tell him that good luck with that, because it's not going to happen as long as Vladimir Putin is president of Russia. Putin is determined to give the United States trouble wherever he can, however he can, and he will do whatever is necessary to do that. Again, he doesn't want a military confrontation with the U.S., but I think he sees lots of opportunities to exploit our weaknesses and our problems, and he's doing that. He will never give up Ukraine and walk that back, or Eastern Ukraine and Crimea. And so I think can't be naive or believe that as long as he's in power, there's actually a chance for reconciliation. One of the things the book does is illustrate how successive presidents have actually tried to work with Putin, but then Putin will do things that make it very, very difficult. And the more he ratchets up internal repression in Russia, the more difficult it is for presidents to do business with him. Similarly, the more he uses cyber and other tools to interfere with our politics, try to divide us as a people, and so on, the more difficult it is for a president to reach out and have a constructive relationship.
You weren't in government when this occurred, but do you have any doubt that our intelligence sources are correct in saying that the Russians did try to interfere with the 2016 election?
There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever.
Okay. So let's say the next president says, okay, Bob, you can't solve Russia for me, but can you solve North Korea for me? What should I do with North Korea? An easier problem.
Well, as I write in the book, we've now had 4 successive presidents try to negotiate denuclearization with North Korea, and all have failed. One of the reasons that I supported President Trump's outreach to Kim Jong-un was that my attitude was, everything else we've tried under his 3 predecessors has failed. Why not give this a shot? Maybe there's a chance. I believe that North Korea will never entirely give up its nuclear capabilities. Kim Jong-un looks at Gaddafi. He gave up his nuclear program. He's dead. His regime is gone. Saddam never had nuclear weapons. He's dead. His regime is gone. Ukraine signed a deal in 1994 in which they gave up 1,800 nuclear weapons in exchange for a guarantee of their territorial integrity by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia, and they've lost half their country. Kim Jong-un looks at that and he said, why in the world would I give up my nuclear weapons? They're the only assurance of survival I have. So the question is whether the president is prepared to, if you will, bite the bullet and say, okay, if we can't get complete nuclearization, can we get them down to a very small number of nuclear weapons with a very intrusive international inspections regime that allows us to contain this threat and keep it to a very low level? That'll be a tough decision for any president.
Now, when you were the head of the CIA, were you surprised that we don't have as much intelligence about what's going on in North Korea in terms of their nuclear program as you might have expected? Or do you think actually we know a fair bit, but it manages not to leak out? We actually know more than the public thinks we know.
Well, North Korea is probably one of the toughest intelligence targets in the world and has been forever. In part because of the magnitude of their totalitarian approach. But we know a fair amount, I think. But the problem is they are inveterate tunnelers. And so getting our arms around how many nuclear weapons they actually have and what they might have hidden and what kind of launchers they may have back in those tunnels would be an immense intelligence challenge. And I haven't been in government now for a dozen years, but I would be very surprised if we knew the locations of all of their nuclear weapons or their missile systems.
Well, you were not in government either when we decided to go into Iraq, and I'll talk about Iraq. We went in part because there was an intelligence belief that they had weapons of mass destruction. Do you think that was an intelligence failure, or it was really the political momentum that really drove the process? And in any event, would you say, with respect to Iraq, going in as we did was a mistake in hindsight?
Well, I think in the first instance, the decision to invade Iraq was based on incorrect intelligence. But it's not just U.S. intelligence that had it wrong. The only reason that UN Resolution 1441 passed in the fall of 2002 in the UN, unanimously, I might add, was that the intelligence services of every major country, including Russia and China, thought that Saddam Hussein was working on weapons of mass destruction. So that resolution demanded that he allow international inspectors to come in. One of the points that I made, and so it was an error of virtually all of the major intelligence services in the world. And one reason they made the error was because Saddam Hussein wanted people to believe that he had weapons of mass destruction. He wanted his own people to believe it. He wanted his military to believe it. And he wanted the Iranians to know it. Or to believe it, and as well as the Israelis. So it was a huge strategic mistake on his part. You know, I make the point in the book that there were actually several occasions in which the invasion of Iraq might have been averted. The first was in 1998 under President Clinton, when at the end of 1998, he and the British launched a major military attack to get international inspectors back into Iraq after Saddam Hussein had thrown them out. They stopped that campaign and without having achieved their objective. And so 1998 marks the point at which the international inspectors were out of Iraq, and Saddam never allowed them back. I argue in the book that one thing that could have been done was to continue those military attacks against Iraqi military targets until Saddam agreed to admit the inspectors back into the country. And if you had inspectors in the country, then there might not have been the questions about weapons of mass destruction. Bush himself, 43, had that option before the invasion and elected not to take that kind of an approach. People will argue about whether Iraq was a mistake or not. I believe that the biggest mistake was in believing that we could change the history of Iraq. And I believe that's the work of decades, and it's certainly not the work of the American Armed Forces. So I think the decisions after the invasion there were some very bad decisions in that respect. And those were the decisions that I think have found us there for now almost 17 years.
So one of the other wars you inherited when you became Secretary of Defense was Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We're still engaged in that war. If the next president of the United States said to you, Bob, I've had enough of this, the American people have had enough, let's get out, what would you tell them about the reality of getting out? And do you think any peace agreement is realistic where the Taliban will not ultimately run Afghanistan?
I think we have to realize, I mean, President Trump is committed to getting all of our troops out of Afghanistan. We're down now to about 8,500. I think the only way that you prevent the Taliban from taking over Afghanistan ultimately is some kind of a residual American military force, maybe the size of what's left there now, helping the Afghan government. There's just no doubt in my mind that given the divisions in Afghanistan, and particularly in the Afghan government, where you have two people claiming to be president in effect, and the corruption and so on, that once the United States is out of there, it will only be a matter of time until the Taliban take over. And, you know, you can argue, and we don't know whether they will roll back all of the reforms, including rights for women, that have been put in place in the last number of years. But my suspicion is that my bet would be that at some point in time, they will reassert their control over Afghanistan if there is no U.S. presence. I argue in the book that we actually should have pulled out of Iraq in January or early 2002, pulled out of Afghanistan, because unlike Iraq, at that point after the Bonn conference, Afghanistan had an internationally recognized government. That interim government was comprised of all the different factions in Afghanistan, Pashtuns and Azaris and Tajiks and so on. It had international recognition. It had commitments from a number of countries for security assistance and for development assistance. And we could have played a part in that with non-military instruments of power. And who knows how that would have turned out? We know how the alternative turned out, and it's 18 years later.
So let's talk a moment about something that happened when you and I were in the White House. The Ayatollah Khomeini took over Iran. You point out in the book that at that time, very few people in the U.S. government even knew what Islamic fundamentalism was. But if the new president were to come in and say to you, Bob, how do I deal with Iran? What would you tell him to do?
I think that the biggest flaw in President Obama's deal with the Iranians was in essence, it kicked the can down the road 10 years. It basically, I think he bet that if we could constrain the Iranian nuclear program for 10 years, that over that period of time, Iran would evolve and be a different kind of country 10 or 15 years later, and a country that would be willing to forswear having nuclear weapons at all. So there wouldn't be a need for an agreement after that. That was a big bet. My suspicion is that it was a wrong bet. So I think that the U.S. position in a negotiation should be that Iran has to give up its nuclear weapon program essentially forever, and in exchange for that, and accompany that with a very intrusive international inspection effort to make sure they're not cheating. And in exchange for that, we'll basically welcome Iran back into the family of nations. We'll lift a lot of the sanctions. Some of the sanctions are still on because of terrorist acts and meddling elsewhere in the Middle East. We'll still have to deal with that. But I think that such an agreement that essentially says that isn't just time limited, but is open ended in terms of not having a nuclear program, is the one that is in everybody's interest, and I think ultimately in the interest of the Iranians as well.
So Bob, I have time for two more questions. First one is this. I'd like to know, in your view, if the next president of the United States that I keep talking about said to you, Bob, I need somebody with your experience, even part-time, to come in and advise my staff in some way, would you come in again to the government in some part-time way, or are you done with government service?
Well, I think if a new president thought I could be helpful in an advisory kind of way, and on a part-time basis, sure, I'd be open to that for the same reason the same answer I gave President Bush back in 2006. We've got a lot of people out there on the front lines. The country's in trouble, and if I could possibly be of any help, I would do so, but not in any kind of a full-time position.
And my final question is, since you've left government service, you've been actively involved in many things. You're the chancellor of the William & Mary, which is your alma mater. You've been the head of the Boy Scouts. What has been most fulfilling for you since you've left government service? Which activity has given you the greatest pleasure?
Well, I think one of the reasons that I've enjoyed those activities in particular, the Scouts and William & Mary, and staying involved in those kinds of things, is that, frankly, one of the reasons for my long-term optimism for the country is the young people that I see, and I saw it at Texas A&M. The young people that I see are very idealistic. They want to help. They're very much into volunteerism. The question is, how do you keep them interested in public service after they've graduated from college? How do you convince them that they need to be a part of something bigger than themselves? And in all honesty, David, one of the concerns that I have is I look at the behavior of a lot of young people right now on the beaches and bars and places like that. There's no sense of civil responsibility that kind of we're all in this together and we have to protect each other. And my hope has been that the young people will get us back on track in that respect.
Bob, I want to thank you as an American for your long service to our country and for the many great things you've done. I enjoyed reading this book. I highly recommend it. And I hope to see you again in person when this COVID-19 is a little bit behind us. Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure.